Dr. Robert Chen had been working at Riverside Pharmaceutical Laboratory for 3 months when he made the discovery that would change everything. The elderly building on Oak Street housed one of the oldest independent labs in Minneapolis, its basement filled with decades of forgotten samples and archived materials. It was March 15, 2005, when Robert decided to finally organize the chaotic storage room. Boxes labeled with dates from the 1980s and 1990s lined metal shelving units, their contents a mystery that previous employees had simply ignored. As the newest pharmacist on staff, Robert felt compelled to bring order to the mess. Behind a stack of yellowed invoices, Robert's flashlight illuminated a glass jar that made his blood freeze. Inside the murky preservation fluid, unmistakably human, was a complete skull. His hands trembled as he lifted the container, noticing the small metal tag tied to the lid with wire. SM. Female. Age 19, 1990. Robert immediately called the Minneapolis Police Department. Detective Maria Santos arrived within 20 minutes, her experienced eyes immediately recognizing the significance of the find. The skull showed clear signs of trauma to the temporal bone, and the preservation suggested someone with medical knowledge had been involved. "We need to check missing persons reports from 1990, Detective Santos told Robert. "Someone with the initials SM. A female, 19 years old. This has been hidden here for 15 years. Within hours, they had a match. Sarah Michelle Patterson had disappeared on October 23, 1990, while working as an assistant at Patterson Family Pharmacy. Her father, William Patterson, had owned the pharmacy for 30 years before selling it in 1991, devastated by his daughter's disappearance. The original investigation had focused on Sarah's boyfriend, Marcus Webb, who had an alibi that checked out. The case went cold after 6 months of intensive searching. Now, 15 years later, the discovery in the laboratory basement would reopen wounds that had never properly healed. Detective Santos contacted William Patterson, now 68 years old and living in a retirement community in St. Paul. His voice broke when she told him about the skull. "I knew she was dead," he whispered, "but I never stopped hoping. Where did you find her? How did she get there?" The Riverside Laboratory had purchased equipment and supplies from Patterson Family Pharmacy during the estate sale in 1991. Someone had deliberately hidden Sarah's remains among the transferred materials, using professional preservation techniques to avoid detection. The killer had medical knowledge and access to both locations. Robert couldn't shake the image of the skull from his mind. That night he called his sister Jennifer, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Minnesota. "Jenny, I found something at work today, something horrible. I need your help understanding what happened to this girl." Jennifer agreed to examine the remains unofficially before the official forensic examination. Her preliminary analysis confirmed the trauma to the skull was consistent with blunt force impact. The preservation method suggested someone wanted to keep the skull as a trophy, not simply dispose of evidence. The news reached the Patterson family quickly. Sarah's younger brother, Michael, now a successful lawyer in Chicago, flew to Minneapolis immediately. The family had established a foundation in Sarah's name, offering scholarships to pharmacy students. Michael had spent years wondering what happened to his sister. "Someone took her from us," Michael told Detective Santos. "Someone we trusted. Sarah wasn't the type to go anywhere with strangers. Whoever did this knew her, had access to our pharmacy, and possessed the knowledge to preserve her skull for 15 years. The investigation officially reopened on March 16, 2005. Detective Santos assembled a team including forensic specialists and cold case investigators. The skull would undergo DNA testing to confirm identity, though the metal tag and circumstances left little doubt. Robert found himself at the center of a murder investigation that stretched back 15 years. The laboratory owner, Dr. George Whitmore, assured him full cooperation with police. "We'll turn this place upside down if necessary," Whitmore promised. "Someone used our facility to hide evidence of murder." As news of the discovery spread through Minneapolis, residents remembered the beautiful 19-year-old girl who had vanished without a trace. Sarah had been studying pharmacy at the University of Minnesota while working at her father's store. She was engaged to her college sweetheart and had her whole life ahead of her. The preservation jar also contained a handwritten note. Barely legible after 15 years. Perfect specimen. October 1990. Study complete. The clinical language chilled investigators. Someone had killed Sarah Patterson not in a moment of passion, but as part of some twisted research project. Detective Santos knew they were looking for someone with extensive medical knowledge, someone who had access to both the pharmacy and the laboratory, someone who could kill a young woman and preserve her skull like a scientific specimen. The investigation would soon reveal that the killer had been hiding in plain sight for 15 years. The original case detective Santos spent the morning reviewing the 1990 case files. Sarah Patterson had last been seen leaving the University of Minnesota pharmacy program at 3:30 p.m. on October 23rd. Her car was found 2 days later in a parking lot near the Mississippi River, keys still in the ignition. The original lead detective, James Morrison, had retired 5 years earlier. Santos contacted him at his cabin in northern Minnesota. Morrison's memory remained sharp regarding the Patterson case. "It haunted me for years," he admitted. "Beautiful girl, loving family, no enemies. She just vanished." Morrison explained that Sarah had been researching a thesis on pharmaceutical preservation techniques. She frequently stayed late at the university lab and had access to various chemicals and equipment. The original investigation explored whether her research had somehow led to her death. "We looked at everyone," Morrison continued. "Professors, lab assistants, family friends, her fiancé Marcus Webb. Everyone had solid alibis for October 23rd. No one seemed capable of murdering Sarah." The case file revealed that Sarah's father, William, had been questioned extensively. As the pharmacy owner, he knew everyone in the local medical community. William had provided investigators with a list of all pharmaceutical suppliers, laboratory contacts, and medical professionals who frequented his store. One name appeared repeatedly in the files: Dr. Edmund Harwick, a prominent pathologist who regularly purchased specialized chemicals from Patterson Family Pharmacy. Harwick had taught at the University of Minnesota Medical School and maintained a private laboratory for research purposes. Detective Santos found Morrison's notes about Harwick interesting. Cooperative but oddly clinical in his responses. Seemed more interested in the forensic aspects of Sarah's disappearance than expressing sympathy for the family. Had detailed knowledge of preservation techniques. Morrison had questioned Harwick 3 times during the original investigation. Each interview revealed Harwick's extensive knowledge of human anatomy and chemical preservation. However, Harwick claimed to be out of town during the week Sarah disappeared, attending a medical conference in Chicago. His alibi checked out, Morrison recalled. Hotel records, conference attendance, dinner receipts. He was definitely in Chicago from October 20th through October 25th, 1990. "We cleared him completely." Detective Santos made notes about Dr. Edmund Harwick. According to the files, he would be 72 years old now, assuming he was still alive. His laboratory had been located just 6 blocks from both Patterson Family Pharmacy and the Riverside Pharmaceutical Laboratory. The original investigation had also focused on Sarah's personal life. She was engaged to Marcus Webb, a fellow pharmacy student. They had dated for 2 years and planned to marry after graduation. Webb had been devastated by Sarah's disappearance and eventually left Minnesota, unable to cope with the memories. Marcus Webb now lived in Seattle, working as a hospital pharmacist. Detective Santos contacted him by phone. Even after 15 years, emotion filled his voice when he spoke about Sarah. "She was everything to me. I've never married, never found anyone else. Have you really found her?" Webb recalled Sarah's excitement about her thesis research. She had been working with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a professor specializing in pharmaceutical preservation. "Sarah was brilliant," Webb remembered. "She wanted to develop new methods for storing medications in developing countries." Dr. Rodriguez, now 67, still taught at the University of Minnesota. Santos arranged to meet with her the following day. Rodriguez had been questioned during the original investigation, but provided little useful information beyond confirming Sarah's academic excellence. The case files also contained interviews with Sarah's co-workers at Patterson Family Pharmacy. The store employed 3 full-time pharmacists besides William Patterson: Dr. Margaret Foster, Dr. Thomas Brennan, and Dr. Helen Clark. All had been cleared during the original investigation. Dr. Margaret Foster had left Minneapolis in 1992, relocating to Florida after the pharmacy was sold. Dr. Thomas Brennan died in 1998 from a heart attack. Dr. Helen Clark continued working in Minneapolis at a chain pharmacy, maintaining her license and reputation over the years. Detective Santos decided to re-interview Dr. Clark. Now 58 years old, Clark worked at a CVS pharmacy in the suburbs. She remembered Sarah fondly as a dedicated student who treated customers with exceptional care and professionalism. Sarah was special, Dr. Clark recalled. She had this natural ability to connect with people. Customers would ask specifically for her help because they trusted her completely. Her father was so proud. Clark provided insight into the pharmacy's daily operations in 1990. We dealt with many medical professionals. Doctors would send prescriptions, researchers would purchase chemicals, hospitals would place large orders. It was a busy place. One detail from Clark's memory intrigued Detective Santos. There was this one doctor who made Sarah uncomfortable. She never said why, but I noticed she would find excuses to avoid helping him when he came in. Dr. Harwick, I think his name was. This contradicted the original investigation's findings. Morrison's notes indicated that Sarah's co-workers had no concerns about any customers or professional contacts. Either Clark's memory was faulty, or something had been missed during the original interviews. Detective Santos reviewed Morrison's interview notes with Clark from 1990. The original interview made no mention of Sarah feeling uncomfortable around any customers. Clark had described all the pharmacy's professional contacts as respectful and appropriate. Sometimes memories change over time, Santos mused. But sometimes people remember details they were afraid to share originally. Uncomfortable truths. Dr. Helen Clark agreed to meet Detective Santos at the CVS pharmacy after hours. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Clark recalled details she had suppressed for 15 years. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked memories she had tried to forget. I should have said something back then, Clark admitted. But Dr. Harwick was so respected, so prominent in the medical community. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Clark explained that Sarah had mentioned Dr. Harwick's unusual behavior during their private conversations. He would ask Sarah specific questions about her research, her university schedule, her personal life, questions that seemed inappropriate for a customer. Detective Santos took careful notes. What kind of questions? He wanted to know about her thesis topic, her laboratory access, what preservation chemicals she was working with. Sarah said he would stand too close when she explained things, make comments about her intelligence that felt personal. Clark recalled one specific incident from September 1990. Dr. Harwick had arrived at the pharmacy just before closing time, asking for Sarah specifically. When told she had left early for a university exam, he seemed agitated and insisted on knowing her exact schedule. William wasn't there that day, Clark continued. I was closing alone with Sarah. Dr. Harwick kept asking when Sarah would be working next, what her university schedule was like. Sarah looked scared. The next morning, Detective Santos contacted Dr. Edmund Harwick. Public records showed he still lived in Minneapolis at the same address from 1990. At 72 years old, Harwick maintained his medical license, though he no longer practiced actively. Harwick agreed to meet at his home, a large Victorian house near the University of Minnesota. Detective Santos brought Officer David Kim as backup. The house contained an extensive library and what appeared to be a private medical laboratory in the basement. I remember the Patterson case well, Dr. Harwick said calmly. Tragic situation. Beautiful young woman with such potential. I was happy to assist the original investigation however possible. Santos asked about his relationship with Sarah and the Patterson family pharmacy. Harwick described it as purely professional. I purchased specialized chemicals for my research. Sarah was knowledgeable and helpful. Nothing more than appropriate business interactions. When confronted with Clark's recollections about Sarah's discomfort, Harwick remained composed. Dr. Clark may be misremembering events from 15 years ago. Grief and time can distort memories. I had only professional interactions with Miss Patterson. Detective Santos asked to see Harwick's laboratory. The basement contained sophisticated equipment for chemical analysis and preservation. Glass jars lined shelves containing various biological specimens for research purposes. The setup was remarkably similar to where Sarah's skull had been found. "Impressive laboratory," Santos commented. "You must have extensive knowledge of preservation techniques." "It's been my life's work," Harwick replied. "Understanding how biological materials can be preserved for study has applications in medicine, research, and forensic science." Officer Kim noticed several jars labeled with dates from 1990. When questioned, Harwick explained they contained tissue samples from his research projects. "I maintain detailed records of all my work. Everything is properly documented and legally obtained." Detective Santos requested permission to examine Harwick's research records from 1990. Harwick hesitated briefly before agreeing. "Of course, I have nothing to hide. My work is always conducted within ethical and legal boundaries." The records showed extensive research into chemical preservation methods during 1990. Several entries mentioned experiments with different preservation solutions and their effects on bone and tissue. The clinical language was similar to the note found with Sarah's skull. One entry from November 1990 caught Santos's attention. "New preservation method successful. Subject material remained intact after 30 days. Technique applicable to long-term storage." The timing was just weeks after Sarah's disappearance. "What subject material were you preserving in November 1990? Santos asked. "Various biological samples," Harwick replied vaguely. "Animal tissue, bone fragments, organic compounds. My records contain all the specifics." Santos noticed gaps in Harwick's records. Several pages appeared to be missing from October and November 1990. When questioned, Harwick claimed the missing pages contained sensitive research data that had been removed for patent applications. "I can provide copies of the patent applications if necessary," Harwick offered. Everything was properly documented with the appropriate authorities. After leaving Harwick's house, Detective Santos felt increasingly suspicious. Harwick's calm demeanor, extensive preservation knowledge, and gaps in his records raised serious concerns. The similarities between his laboratory and the location where Sarah's skull was found seemed more than coincidental. Officer Kim shared Santos's concerns. "His whole basement setup looks like where someone could hide evidence for years, and those missing pages from his records seem awfully convenient." Santos decided to investigate Harwick's alibi from 1990 more thoroughly. The original investigation had confirmed his attendance at the Chicago Medical Conference, but 15 years later, it might be possible to find inconsistencies or gaps. A call to the conference organizers revealed their records from 1990 had been destroyed in a fire in 1995. Hotel records were also unavailable due to the age of the information. Harwick's alibi, which had seemed solid during the original investigation, could no longer be verified. Detective Santos also discovered that Harwick had purchased equipment and supplies from the Patterson family pharmacy estate sale in 1991. This gave him direct access to materials that were later transferred to Riverside Pharmaceutical Laboratory, where Sarah's skull was hidden. He had means, opportunity, and motive, Santos told her supervisor, plus specialized knowledge to preserve the skull and access to hide it where it wouldn't be discovered for years. The investigation was shifting focus toward Dr. Edmund Harwick, but Santos knew they needed more concrete evidence to build a case after 15 years. The web of deception. Detective Santos obtained a warrant to thoroughly search Dr. Harwick's property and examine all his records from 1990. The search team included forensic specialists and cold case investigators who understood the complexities of evidence that had been hidden for 15 years. In Harwick's basement laboratory, investigators found a hidden compartment behind a false wall. Inside were detailed journals documenting his obsession with Sarah Patterson. Page after page revealed his growing fixation with the young pharmacy student and his plans to make her part of his research. The journals painted a disturbing picture of Dr. Harwick's psychological state in 1990. He had been watching Sarah for months, learning her schedule, documenting her activities, and planning what he described as the perfect acquisition of a research specimen. One entry from September 1990 read, Subject SP represents ideal candidate for preservation study. Young, healthy, intelligent. Access through pharmacy relationship provides opportunity. Must plan carefully to avoid suspicion. Detective Santos called in Dr. Patricia Hayes, a forensic psychiatrist, to analyze Harwick's writings. Dr. Hayes identified clear signs of psychopathy and obsessive behavior. This man was planning murder, not conducting legitimate research. Sarah Patterson was his target for months. The investigation revealed that Harwick had lied about his alibi for October 23, 1990. While conference records had been destroyed, investigators found canceled airline tickets in Harwick's name. He had booked flights to Chicago but never boarded them, instead using the conference registration as cover for his planned crime. Security footage from 1990 was long destroyed, but Detective Santos tracked down former employees at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. One retired security guard, Frank Miller, remembered processing a complaint about abandoned luggage around October 24, 1990. Guy had checked a bag for Chicago but never showed up for his flight, Miller recalled. We held the luggage for a week before storage. Happened sometimes when people missed flights, but this one was different. Miller remembered the luggage contained medical equipment and chemicals. The passenger had paid for the flight but deliberately missed it, creating a false paper trail suggesting he was out of town. The abandoned luggage was eventually destroyed according to airport policy. Further investigation revealed that Harwick had rented a vehicle under a false name on October 23, 1990. The rental company's records showed the car was returned on October 25, with additional mileage consistent with trips between his laboratory, the university, and remote areas outside Minneapolis. Detective Santos contacted the rental company's former manager, Robert Torres, now retired in Arizona. Torres remembered the rental because of unusual circumstances. Customer paid cash, used a fake ID that looked professional. We were busy and didn't verify it properly. Car came back clean, like someone had detailed it. The forensic team found traces of Sarah's DNA in Harwick's laboratory, specifically on equipment used for bone preparation and preservation. Despite 15 years and Harwick's cleaning efforts, microscopic evidence remained on specialized tools that were difficult to thoroughly sanitize. Blood spatter analysis revealed patterns on the laboratory walls consistent with violent trauma. Luminol testing showed evidence of extensive cleanup efforts, but forensic science had advanced significantly since 1990, allowing investigators to detect trace evidence that would have been invisible with older techniques. Dr. Harwick's financial records from 1990 showed unusual purchases of chemicals and preservation materials in October, far exceeding his normal research requirements. Credit card statements revealed trips to medical supply companies in 3 different cities during the week Sarah disappeared. The investigation also uncovered Dr. Harwick's connection to other missing persons cases. Between 1985 and 1995, 4 young women involved in medical or pharmaceutical studies had disappeared in Minnesota and Wisconsin. All were college students with access to university laboratories. Detective Santos contacted law enforcement agencies in Wisconsin and northern Minnesota. Cold case investigators found similarities in the disappearances. All victims were students, all vanished without a trace, and all had some connection to medical research or pharmaceutical work. Jennifer Walsh, who had disappeared in Madison, Wisconsin in 1987, had been studying biochemistry at the University of Wisconsin. Like Sarah, Jennifer had been working on preservation techniques and had visited medical laboratories in Minneapolis shortly before her disappearance. Susan Morrison, no relation to Detective Morrison, vanished in Duluth in 1993 while conducting research for her medical degree. Her advisor remembered that Susan had been collaborating with a pathologist from Minneapolis on a project involving tissue preservation. The pattern was becoming clear. Dr. Harwick had been selecting young women involved in medical research, killing them, and preserving parts of their bodies for his twisted collection. Sarah Patterson was not his first victim, and she likely would not have been his last. Detective Santos coordinated with federal authorities as the case expanded beyond Minneapolis. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit profiled Harwick as a serial killer who targeted intelligent young women in medical fields, using his professional status to gain their trust. Harwick's journals revealed his belief that he was conducting important research by preserving perfect specimens of young, intelligent women. His writings showed no remorse or recognition that his actions were criminal rather than scientific. The investigation team found evidence that Harwick had been planning to target another victim in 1991. His journals contained detailed notes about a pharmacy student at the University of Minnesota who fit his preferred profile. The student had left the program shortly after Sarah's disappearance, possibly saving her own life. As evidence mounted against Dr. Harwick, Detective Santos prepared for his arrest. The case that had begun with a horrifying discovery in a laboratory basement was revealing the true scope of one man's monstrous crimes spanning a decade. Confronting the monster, Detective Santos coordinated with federal authorities to arrest Dr. Edmund Harwick simultaneously at his home and laboratory. The coordinated operation involved local police, FBI agents, and forensic specialists who needed to preserve evidence from multiple crime scenes. On March 28, 2005, at 6 a.m., law enforcement surrounded Harwick's Victorian house. Detective Santos approached the front door while FBI agents secured the back exit and basement laboratory. The arrest needed to be executed perfectly to prevent Harwick from destroying evidence or harming himself. Harwick answered the door calmly, as if expecting the visit. "I assume you have questions about my research," he said matter-of-factly. "I've been conducting important work for decades. Society doesn't always understand scientific advancement. Dr. Edmund Harwick, you're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Michelle Patterson," Detective Santos announced. "You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney." As handcuffs were applied, Harwick showed no emotion. "Sarah was a perfect specimen. Her preservation has contributed valuable data to scientific knowledge. Her sacrifice served a greater purpose than her mundane life would have achieved." The cold, clinical language chilled everyone present. Harwick spoke about Sarah's murder as if discussing a laboratory experiment. His complete lack of remorse confirmed the psychological profile developed by FBI analysts. During the search of Harwick's laboratory, investigators found additional human remains. Hidden compartments contained preserved tissue samples and bone fragments from multiple victims. Each specimen was labeled with clinical descriptions rather than human names. FBI agent Rebecca Chen, who specialized in serial killer cases, led the interrogation. Harwick was transported to federal facilities equipped to handle dangerous offenders. His cooperation would be essential to identifying all victims and recovering their remains. "Dr. Harwick, we've found evidence connecting you to multiple murders spanning 10 years, Agent Chen began. "Sarah Patterson, Jennifer Walsh, Susan Morrison, and others. We need to know about all your victims." Harwick remained calm and analytical. "My research subjects were carefully selected based on scientific criteria: age, health, education level, and potential contribution to preservation studies. Each case provided valuable data." The interrogation revealed Harwick's systematic approach to selecting and killing his victims. He had attended conferences, visited universities, and frequented pharmacies to identify potential targets. His professional status gave him access to young women in medical fields. "Sarah Patterson was particularly interesting," Harwick explained. "Her thesis research on preservation techniques demonstrated exceptional understanding. I studied her work before determining she would be an ideal subject." Agent Chen pressed for details about how Sarah was killed. Harwick's clinical description was horrifying in its matter-of-fact delivery. He had lured Sarah to his laboratory under the pretense of helping with her thesis research. "She came willingly," Harwick said. "I offered to show her advanced preservation techniques that would enhance her academic work. She was eager to learn. The killing was quick and efficient. I preserved the skull for long-term study." The confession continued with details about other victims. Jennifer Walsh had been researching preservation methods that caught Harwick's attention at a conference. Susan Morrison had contacted him seeking collaboration on her medical research project. Each murder followed a similar pattern. Harwick would establish professional contact, gain the victim's trust through offers of academic assistance, lure them to his laboratory, and kill them for his collection. He viewed the murders as scientific research rather than crimes. FBI agents worked with law enforcement agencies in multiple states to identify all of Harwick's victims. His journals contained references to 12 different research subjects over a 10-year period from 1985 to 1995. The investigation revealed that Harwick had stopped killing after 1995 due to increased security measures at universities and laboratories. He spent the next decade studying and preserving the remains he had collected, convincing himself that his crimes served scientific purposes. Detective Santos contacted families of the identified victims. Each conversation was heartbreaking as parents and siblings learned the fate of loved ones who had vanished years or decades earlier. Many had never stopped hoping their daughters or sisters might still be alive. William Patterson, Sarah's father, was brought to the federal facility to confront the man who had killed his daughter. The 68-year-old pharmacist faced Harwick with dignity and composure that impressed everyone present. "You took my daughter from me," Patterson said quietly. "You stole her life, her future, her chance to help people through pharmacy work. She wanted to make the world better. Instead, you made it worse." Harwick's response showed his complete disconnect from human emotion. Sarah's preservation has advanced scientific understanding of bone and tissue degradation. Her contribution to research will be remembered long after her ordinary life would have been forgotten. The clinical coldness of Harwick's words affected even experienced FBI agents. Agent Chen later described it as one of the most chilling interactions she had experienced with a serial killer. As news of Harwick's arrest and confession spread, the medical community was shocked. Colleagues who had known him for decades struggled to reconcile the respected pathologist with the monster he had revealed himself to be. The University of Minnesota launched an investigation into how Harwick had used his position to identify and target victims. Security measures were implemented to prevent similar situations in the future. Harwick's arraignment was scheduled for April 5, 2005. Federal prosecutors prepared charges for multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. The death penalty was under consideration, given the premeditated nature and scope of his crimes. The full scope of evil. Dr. Patricia Hayes completed her psychological evaluation of Edmund Harwick, revealing the depth of his psychopathy. The forensic psychiatrist found Harwick to be completely lacking in empathy, viewing other human beings solely as objects for his research purposes. "This individual represents the most dangerous type of killer," Dr. Hayes explained to prosecutors. "He is highly intelligent, methodical, and completely without conscience. His professional status allowed him to operate undetected for years." FBI profilers determined that Harwick had likely killed more victims than those already identified. His journals contained cryptic references to earlier specimens and preliminary studies that suggested murders dating back to the early 1980s. Agent Rebecca Chen coordinated with international law enforcement agencies. Harwick's travel records showed visits to medical conferences in Canada, Mexico, and European countries during the 1980s. Each trip coincided with missing persons reports of young women involved in medical or pharmaceutical studies. The investigation expanded to include potential victims in Toronto, Montreal, Mexico City, London, and Amsterdam. Local authorities began reviewing cold cases of missing medical students and researchers who had disappeared during Harwick's documented travels. In Toronto, Detective Inspector Sarah MacDonald found the case of Claire Dubois, a 21-year-old pharmacy student who vanished in 1984 after meeting with an American pathologist about collaboration on her research project. Dubois had been working on medication preservation for remote communities. The American doctor had impressive credentials, MacDonald explained to Agent Chen. Claire was excited about the opportunity to work with someone of his stature. She left for their meeting and never returned. Similar patterns emerged in other cities. Young women involved in medical research would be approached by a respected American pathologist offering collaboration or advanced training. They would agree to meet with him and subsequently vanish without a trace. The international scope of Harwick's crimes shocked investigators. Conservative estimates suggested he had murdered at least 25 young women over a 30-year period. His professional status and international connections had enabled him to kill across multiple jurisdictions without detection. Forensic accountants traced Harwick's financial records back to 1975. His income came from legitimate medical work, but his spending patterns revealed expensive international travel and purchases of specialized preservation equipment. He had been planning and executing murders for decades. The examination of Harwick's property revealed additional evidence of his international crimes. Hidden in his basement were preserved tissue samples labeled with dates and locations, corresponding to missing women in various countries. Each sample was accompanied by detailed notes about preservation techniques and long-term storage results. Harwick's library contained extensive research on international law enforcement procedures, extradition treaties, and jurisdictional limitations. He had carefully studied how to commit crimes across borders without triggering coordinated investigations. During continued interrogations, Harwick revealed his systematic approach to international hunting. Different countries have varying investigative capabilities, he explained coldly. By distributing my research across multiple jurisdictions, I minimized the risk of pattern detection. Agent Chen pressed for details about specific international victims. Harwick's clinical descriptions revealed the calculated nature of his crimes. He would research potential targets for months, learning their schedules, academic interests, and personal relationships before making contact. Claire Dubois in Toronto was particularly promising, Harwick recalled. Her research on medication preservation in extreme climates was innovative. I studied her work for 6 months before approaching her advisor to arrange our meeting. The confession continued with details about victims in Mexico City, London, and Amsterdam. Each murder had been carefully planned to appear as if the victim had simply vanished. Harwick used his medical knowledge to ensure deaths were quick and efficient, then transported preserved remains back to his Minneapolis laboratory. International arrest warrants were issued for Harwick in 6 countries. However, federal prosecutors decided to proceed with domestic charges first, as the evidence was strongest for murders committed on American soil. William Patterson struggled to comprehend the scope of his daughter's killer's crimes. Sarah wasn't his only victim, he told Detective Santos. 25 families have lost daughters because of this monster. How did he operate for so long without being caught? The answer lay in Harwick's intelligence, professional status, and systematic approach to avoiding detection. He had exploited the trust that medical communities placed in credentialed professionals and the limitations of international law enforcement cooperation in the 1980s and 1990s. Universities and medical schools worldwide began reviewing their security procedures and collaboration protocols. The Harwick case revealed dangerous vulnerabilities in how academic institutions facilitated contact between established professionals and young researchers. The FBI established a task force to coordinate with international partners in identifying all of Harwick's victims. Many cases that had been unsolved for decades were now being connected to the systematic killer who had operated across continents. Dr. Jennifer Chen, Robert's sister, assisted in analyzing the preserved remains found in Harwick's laboratory. Her forensic anthropology expertise helped identify victims and provide closure to families who had wondered for years about their missing daughters. Each of these young women had potential to contribute to medical science, Dr. Chen explained to investigators. Instead, their lives were stolen by someone who perverted scientific research into a justification for murder. The international investigation was expected to continue for years, as authorities worked to identify all victims and provide closure to affected families. Harwick's crimes represented one of the most extensive and systematic serial killing sprees in modern history. Federal prosecutors prepared to seek the death penalty, though international partners expressed interest in extraditing Harwick to face charges in their jurisdictions as well. The legal proceedings would be complex, but justice for Sarah Patterson and all of Harwick's victims was finally within reach. The hunt for justice. On April 15, 2005, federal prosecutors formally charged Dr. Edmund Harwick with 12 counts of first-degree murder, 6 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of abuse of a corpse. The charges covered victims in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois, with additional charges expected as the international investigation continued. Harwick's defense team, led by renowned criminal attorney David Morrison, no relation to the original detective, argued that their client suffered from severe mental illness that precluded criminal responsibility. They requested extensive psychological evaluations and competency hearings. Dr. Harwick's actions, while horrific, were the result of profound psychological disorders, Morrison argued during preliminary hearings. His delusions about scientific research rendered him unable to understand the criminal nature of his actions. Federal prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez countered that Harwick's careful planning, international operations, and decades of avoiding detection demonstrated clear criminal intent and understanding of his actions' illegality. This defendant knew exactly what he was doing and took elaborate steps to avoid capture. The competency hearing lasted 3 weeks, as multiple psychiatric experts evaluated Harwick's mental state. Dr. Patricia Hayes testified that while Harwick was clearly psychopathic, he remained competent to stand trial and understood the charges against him. The defendant shows no signs of psychosis or delusions that would impair his understanding of legal proceedings, Dr. Hayes explained to the court. His claims about scientific research are post hoc rationalizations, not genuine delusions. Judge Margaret Foster, coincidentally sharing a name with the former Patterson Pharmacy employee, ruled that Harwick was competent to stand trial. The proceedings would continue with jury selection scheduled for September 2005. Meanwhile, investigators continued uncovering evidence of Harwick's crimes. Ground-penetrating radar searches of his property revealed additional burial sites. Forensic anthropologists carefully excavated remains that Harwick had buried when preservation was not practical for his collection. Detective Santos worked with victim advocates to support the families affected by Harwick's crimes. Each identification of remains brought both closure and renewed grief to parents and siblings who had hoped their daughters might somehow still be alive. International extradition requests complicated the legal proceedings. Canada, the United Kingdom, and Mexico filed formal requests to prosecute Harwick for crimes committed in their jurisdictions. Federal authorities had to balance competing demands for justice. William Patterson organized a support group for families of Harwick's victims. The group met monthly at a Minneapolis community center, providing emotional support and coordinating their involvement in the legal proceedings. "We're not just seeking justice for our daughters," Patterson explained at one meeting. "We're working to ensure this monster can never hurt anyone again, and that the system changes prevent future predators from operating the way Harwick did." The Sarah Patterson Foundation expanded its mission beyond pharmacy scholarships to include funding for improved university security measures and international cooperation in tracking missing persons cases. The foundation worked with law enforcement agencies to develop better protocols for identifying serial killers who operate across jurisdictions. Harwick's former colleagues at the University of Minnesota faced intense scrutiny. Several faculty members acknowledged warning signs they had ignored or rationalized away. Harwick's interest in young female students had been noted but not reported due to his professional reputation. Dr. Robert Chen, who had discovered Sarah's skull, struggled with the psychological impact of his role in the case. He continued working at the pharmaceutical laboratory while attending counseling sessions to process the trauma of his discovery. "I keep thinking about how many years Sarah's remains were hidden just feet from where I worked," Robert confided to Detective Santos. "If I had cleaned that storage room sooner, maybe other victims would have been saved." Santos reassured Robert that his discovery was crucial to stopping Harwick and bringing justice to all the victims. "You ended his ability to kill again," she reminded him. "Without your discovery, he might have continued for many more years." The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit used the Harwick case to develop improved profiles for the hunt for justice. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit used the Harwick case to develop improved profiles for serial killers who exploit professional credentials to access victims. Agent Chen worked with university security directors nationwide to implement screening procedures for visiting researchers and guest lecturers. Media attention intensified as details of the international investigation emerged. Families of missing women from across North America and Europe contacted authorities, hoping their loved ones might finally be identified among Harwick's victims. Dr. Harwick remained in federal custody at a maximum security facility in Minnesota. His behavior in prison was consistent with his psychological profile: calm, analytical, and completely unrepentant. He spent his time writing detailed accounts of his research methodology, despite his attorney's advice to remain silent. Prison psychiatrist Dr. Michael Torres reported that Harwick showed no signs of remorse or recognition that his actions were criminal. He continues to view his murders as scientific achievements. He's proud of his work and frustrated that others don't appreciate his contributions to preservation science. The International Task Force made breakthrough discoveries in several cold cases. In London, investigators found records of Dr. Edmund Harwick presenting at a 1986 medical conference where 22-year-old medical student Emma Thompson had disappeared. Thompson's research on pharmaceutical storage methods matched Harwick's target profile perfectly. Similar connections emerged in Amsterdam, where Harwick had visited in 1988, coinciding with the disappearance of chemistry student Ingrid Vanderberg. Mexican authorities linked him to 3 missing medical students from Mexico City between 1989 and 1992. The scope of Harwick's crimes became clear as international investigators shared information. Conservative estimates suggested at least 32 victims across 7 countries over a 28-year period. He had been one of the most prolific and geographically diverse serial killers in modern history. Defense attorney Morrison attempted to negotiate a plea agreement to avoid the death penalty. He offered full cooperation in identifying all victims and recovering remains in exchange for life imprisonment without parole. Federal prosecutors initially rejected the offer, determined to seek maximum punishment. However, victim families were divided on the death penalty question. Some, like William Patterson, wanted Harwick executed for his crimes. Others preferred life imprisonment if it meant obtaining information about additional victims and achieving closure for more families. "I want him to pay for what he did to Sarah," Patterson told prosecutors. "But if keeping him alive means other parents can finally bury their daughters, maybe that's more important than my desire for revenge." The ethical complexity of the decision weighed heavily on prosecutor Rodriguez. Harwick's cooperation was essential for identifying international victims, but accepting a plea deal seemed inadequate punishment for decades of systematic murder. Judge Foster scheduled a victim impact hearing for July 2005, allowing families to address the court about their preferences regarding plea negotiations. The hearing would help determine whether prosecutors should continue seeking the death penalty or accept Harwick's offer of cooperation. Meanwhile, forensic investigators continued examining evidence from Harwick's laboratory and property. Advanced DNA analysis identified several previously unknown victims, bringing the confirmed death toll to 15 with strong evidence of many more. Dr. Jennifer Chen completed her analysis of the preserved remains. Her report provided detailed information about how each victim died, confirming the systematic and premeditated nature of Harwick's crimes. The evidence supported charges of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances in every case. International law enforcement agencies pressed for Harwick's extradition after any domestic proceedings concluded. Canadian authorities had particularly strong evidence linking him to at least 4 murders, while British investigators connected him to 3 confirmed killings. The legal complexity of prosecuting an international serial killer became apparent as jurisdictional disputes emerged. Multiple countries had legitimate claims to prosecute Harwick, but practical limitations meant he could only be tried in a few jurisdictions during his lifetime. Federal prosecutors decided to proceed with the strongest domestic cases first, using them to establish patterns that would support international prosecutions. The Minnesota trial would focus on Sarah Patterson's murder and 5 other confirmed domestic victims. Detective Santos prepared for months of testimony as the prosecution's key witness. Her investigation had uncovered the evidence linking Harwick to multiple murders and exposed his systematic approach to killing young women in the medical field. As the trial date approached, William Patterson reflected on the 15 years since Sarah's disappearance. "I always knew she was dead," he told reporters. "But I never imagined her killer was someone who had pretended to be a respectable member of our community for decades." The revelation that a trusted medical professional had systematically murdered young women shocked the Minneapolis community. Universities implemented new security measures, and professional organizations developed stricter oversight procedures for member interactions with students. Harwick's trial would not only seek justice for his victims, but also examine how his professional status had enabled decades of killing. The case would influence law enforcement training, university security policies, and international cooperation in tracking serial killers who operate across borders. The trial of Edmund Harwick, September 12, 2005, marked the beginning of what legal experts called one of the most significant serial killer trials in American history. Federal prosecutors had assembled overwhelming evidence against Dr. Edmund Harwick, while his defense team continued arguing for mitigation based on mental illness. Judge Margaret Foster presided over jury selection, which took 3 weeks due to extensive media coverage and the international scope of the crimes. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 67, representing diverse professional and educational backgrounds. Prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez delivered a powerful opening statement, outlining Harwick's systematic approach to murder over nearly 3 decades. The evidence will show that Edmund Harwick was not a researcher, but a predator who used his medical credentials to identify, stalk, and kill young women across multiple countries. Rodriguez explained how Harwick had exploited the trust that academic communities placed in credentialed professionals. He attended conferences, visited universities, and cultivated relationships with pharmacy programs specifically to identify potential victims. Sarah Patterson and at least 14 other young women died because they trusted a man who wore the disguise of medical respectability. Defense attorney David Morrison argued that Harwick suffered from severe psychological disorders that rendered him incapable of understanding his actions' criminal nature. Dr. Harwick genuinely believed he was conducting legitimate scientific research. His mental illness created delusions that prevented him from recognizing the humanity of his victims. The prosecution's case began with Detective Santos testifying about discovering Sarah Patterson's preserved skull and the subsequent investigation. Her detailed account of uncovering evidence in Harwick's laboratory captivated the jury and established the methodical nature of his crimes. Dr. Robert Chen described finding Sarah's remains in the pharmaceutical laboratory basement. His emotional testimony about the horrifying discovery resonated with jurors, particularly when he explained how the preservation methods indicated extensive medical knowledge and planning. William Patterson took the stand to describe his daughter's life and the impact of her murder on their family. The 68-year-old pharmacist's quiet dignity impressed everyone in the courtroom as he spoke about Sarah's dreams of helping people through pharmaceutical work. Sarah wanted to develop better ways to store medications for people in developing countries, Patterson testified. She believed pharmacy work was about serving others and improving lives. Instead, her life was stolen by someone who perverted medical knowledge into justification for murder. FBI agent Rebecca Chen testified about the international scope of Harwick's crimes, presenting evidence linking him to victims in 7 countries. Her presentation included maps showing Harwick's travel patterns and their correlation with missing persons reports of young women in medical fields. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the forensic psychiatrist, explained Harwick's psychological profile to the jury. The defendant exhibits classic psychopathic traits: lack of empathy, manipulation of others, and inability to form genuine emotional connections. However, he clearly understood that murder was illegal and took elaborate steps to avoid detection. The prosecution presented Harwick's journals as evidence of premeditation and criminal intent. Excerpts read in court revealed his systematic approach to selecting victims and his complete lack of remorse for their deaths. One particularly damning journal entry from 1990 read, "Subject SP represents ideal opportunity for advanced preservation study. Must plan approach carefully to avoid suspicion from family and authorities. Academic pretense provides perfect cover for acquisition." Defense witnesses included psychiatrists who argued that Harwick's writings demonstrated delusional thinking rather than criminal planning. Dr. Michael Thompson testified that Harwick genuinely believed he was conducting legitimate research, despite the obviously criminal nature of his actions. The defendant's journals show systematic delusions about the scientific value of his work, Dr. Thompson explained. He truly believed that preserving these young women served a greater scientific purpose. This level of delusion indicates severe mental illness. However, prosecution witnesses contradicted this interpretation. Dr. Patricia Hayes returned to testify that Harwick's careful planning, international operations, and efforts to avoid detection demonstrated clear understanding of his actions' illegality. International law enforcement officials testified via video link about Harwick's crimes in their jurisdictions. Canadian Detective Inspector Sarah MacDonald described the disappearance of Claire Dubois and evidence linking Harwick to her murder. The defendant used identical methods in Toronto that he employed in Minneapolis, MacDonald testified. He approached Miss Dubois through academic channels, offered collaboration on her research, and lured her to a meeting from which she never returned. The trial's most dramatic moment came when prosecutors played recordings of Harwick's confession to FBI agents. His cold clinical description of murdering Sarah Patterson shocked the courtroom, particularly when he referred to her as an ideal specimen, rather than using her name. In the recordings, Harwick's voice showed no emotion as he described killing Sarah. The subject arrived at my laboratory as scheduled. I explained that I wanted to demonstrate advanced preservation techniques relevant to her thesis work. The procedure was completed quickly and efficiently. Defense attorneys objected repeatedly to the confession recordings, arguing they demonstrated mental illness rather than criminal intent. However, Judge Foster allowed the recordings as evidence of Harwick's understanding of his actions and their consequences. Medical examiner Dr. Lisa Rodriguez testified about the cause of death for identified victims. Her analysis of preserved remains revealed that each victim had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with deliberate murder rather than accidental death. The trauma patterns indicate the victims were struck with a heavy, blunt instrument, Dr. Rodriguez explained. The force and placement of the injuries suggest someone with anatomical knowledge who intended to cause immediate death. The prosecution concluded its case with testimony from forensic accountants who traced Harwick's financial records over 3 decades. Their analysis revealed systematic purchases of preservation chemicals, international travel expenses, and equipment acquisitions that supported his killing spree. As the defense began presenting its case, the weight of evidence against Harwick seemed overwhelming. However, his attorneys continued arguing for mitigation based on mental illness, hoping to avoid the death penalty even if they couldn't secure an acquittal. Judgment and consequences. The defense case focused entirely on mental health mitigation, as Harwick's guilt was undeniable given his detailed confessions and the overwhelming physical evidence. Dr. Michael Thompson returned to testify about Harwick's childhood and psychological development. The defendant experienced severe emotional neglect and possible abuse during his formative years, Dr. Thompson explained. His father was a demanding physician who viewed young Edmund more as a research project than a child. This dysfunction contributed to his inability to form normal human attachments. Defense attorneys presented testimony from former colleagues who described Harwick as brilliant but emotionally detached throughout his career. Several witnesses noted his unusual interest in preservation techniques and his clinical approach to discussing death and human remains. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuropsychologist, testified about brain imaging studies conducted on Harwick while in custody. The scans reveal abnormalities in regions associated with empathy and emotional processing. These structural differences may explain his inability to recognize the humanity of his victims. However, prosecution experts challenged the defense's mental health arguments. Dr. Patricia Hayes returned to testify that brain abnormalities did not excuse criminal behavior or indicate inability to understand legal and moral boundaries. Many individuals have similar brain abnormalities without becoming serial killers, Dr. Hayes explained. The defendant's systematic planning, international operations, and success in avoiding detection for decades demonstrate intact cognitive functioning and clear understanding of legal consequences. The prosecution called rebuttal witnesses to counterclaims about Harwick's mental state. Former students and colleagues testified that he had always appeared calculating and manipulative, rather than delusional or psychotic. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Sarah Patterson's former thesis advisor, provided devastating testimony about Harwick's manipulation of the academic community. He cultivated relationships with faculty specifically to gain access to our students. His interest in young women researchers was predatory, not academic. International victims' families testified via video link about the impact of Harwick's crimes on their lives. Claire Dubois' parents described 20 years of wondering what happened to their daughter, and the relief of finally learning the truth, despite its horror. "We never stopped hoping Claire might come home," her mother testified through tears. "Learning she was murdered was devastating, but at least we finally know. This monster stole not just our daughter's life, but 20 years of our lives wondering and hoping." The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by Amanda Rodriguez, summarized the evidence of Harwick's systematic killing spree and rejected claims of mental illness mitigation. This defendant committed calculated murder for personal gratification while hiding behind professional credentials and false claims of scientific research. Rodriguez emphasized the international scope of Harwick's crimes and their impact on victim families. Edmund Harwick is not a mentally ill researcher who lost his way. He is a predator who spent 3 decades hunting and killing young women while society trusted him because of his medical degree. Defense attorney Morrison made a final plea for mercy, arguing that execution would serve no purpose given Harwick's age and the finality of life imprisonment. The defendant will never again be free to harm anyone. Life imprisonment achieves the goals of justice and public safety without the finality of execution. Morrison also emphasized Harwick's willingness to cooperate in identifying additional victims and recovering remains. The families of victims in multiple countries deserve closure. Dr. Harwick's cooperation in providing information about other crimes serves the interests of justice better than his execution. The jury deliberated for 6 days, carefully reviewing evidence from what had become one of the most complex serial killer cases in American legal history. They requested clarification on legal definitions of premeditation and the standards for mental health mitigation. On October 18, 2005, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges: 12 counts of first-degree murder, 6 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of abuse of a corpse. The verdict was unanimous on all counts, reflecting the overwhelming nature of the evidence. Judge Foster scheduled the penalty phase for November, allowing both sides to present additional evidence regarding appropriate sentencing. The death penalty remained under consideration, though victim families remained divided on the question. Following the guilty verdicts, several victim families spoke to media about their relief at achieving justice. William Patterson expressed gratitude to law enforcement officials who had solved his daughter's case after 15 years. "Sarah can finally rest in peace," Patterson told reporters. "Her killer will never hurt another young woman. That's what matters most to our family." International arrest warrants remained active for Harwick in multiple countries. Canadian authorities indicated they would seek extradition after any domestic sentence was completed, ensuring he would face additional prosecutions for crimes committed abroad. The University of Minnesota implemented comprehensive reforms to prevent similar situations in the future. New policies required background checks for visiting researchers, limited unsupervised contact between outside professionals and students, and established clear protocols for reporting suspicious behavior. Federal law enforcement agencies used the Harwick case to improve international cooperation in tracking serial offenders. The FBI established new protocols for sharing information about traveling professionals who might pose risks to vulnerable populations. Dr. Jennifer Chen published academic papers about the forensic analysis of Harwick's preserved specimens, contributing to scientific knowledge while ensuring the victims' deaths served some constructive purpose. Her work helped other forensic anthropologists identify remains in similar cases. The Sarah Patterson Foundation expanded its mission to include advocacy for missing persons investigations and support for victim families. The foundation funded research into improving international law enforcement cooperation and early detection of serial offenders. As the penalty phase approached, prosecutors prepared arguments for the death penalty, while defense attorneys continued seeking life imprisonment. The complexity of executing justice for crimes spanning multiple countries and decades would challenge the legal system's ability to provide appropriate punishment. The Harwick case had exposed vulnerabilities in academic institutions, international law enforcement cooperation, and professional oversight systems. The trial's conclusion would mark the beginning of systemic reforms designed to prevent similar predators from exploiting professional credentials to commit systematic murder. Final justice and lasting legacy. The penalty phase of Edmund Harwick's trial began on November 15, 2005. With prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez arguing for the death penalty based on the systematic nature of his crimes and their international scope. The defendant spent 3 decades hunting and killing young women across multiple countries. The scale and premeditation of his crimes warrant the ultimate punishment. Rodriguez presented testimony from family members of victims in 7 countries, creating a powerful narrative about the global impact of Harwick's killing spree. Each family's story reinforced the argument that his crimes transcended typical murder cases and represented a systematic attack on vulnerable young women pursuing medical careers. Defense attorney Morrison countered with arguments about Harwick's age, his cooperation with authorities, and the practical benefits of life imprisonment. At 72 years old, the defendant poses no future threat to society. His continued cooperation in identifying victims and recovering remains serves justice better than execution. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning with a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Several jurors later explained that while they found Harwick's crimes deserving of death, his cooperation in identifying international victims and the wishes of some victim families influenced their decision. Judge Foster formally sentenced Harwick on December 10, 2005, to life imprisonment on each murder count, with sentences to run consecutively. The judge emphasized that Harwick would never be eligible for parole and would die in federal custody. Dr. Edmund Harwick, you have committed some of the most heinous crimes in American legal history, Judge Foster declared during sentencing. You exploited professional trust to systematically murder young women whose only crime was pursuing careers in medical fields. Society is better protected with you permanently removed from it. Harwick showed no emotion during sentencing, maintaining the clinical detachment that had characterized his behavior throughout the trial. His only statement to the court was a brief comment about his willingness to continue cooperating with international investigations. Following domestic sentencing, Canadian authorities immediately filed extradition requests to prosecute Harwick for murders committed in their jurisdiction. Similar requests came from the United Kingdom, Mexico, and the Netherlands, creating a complex legal situation regarding international prosecution. Federal prosecutors negotiated agreements allowing international prosecutions while ensuring Harwick remained in American custody. The arrangements would permit foreign authorities to conduct trials via video link or transport Harwick for brief court appearances while maintaining his life sentence. William Patterson attended the sentencing hearing, finally achieving closure 15 years after Sarah's disappearance. Justice has been served, he told reporters afterward. Sarah and all the other victims can finally rest in peace knowing their killer will never hurt anyone again. The Sarah Patterson Foundation organized a memorial service for all identified victims, attended by families from multiple countries. The service honored the dreams and potential of young women whose lives were stolen by Harwick's systematic killing spree. Dr. Robert Chen, who had discovered Sarah's skull, spoke at the memorial about the importance of never forgetting the victim's humanity. These weren't specimens or research subjects. They were daughters, sisters, and students with bright futures ahead of them. We honor them by ensuring their deaths led to changes that protect others. International law enforcement agencies implemented new protocols for tracking traveling professionals and sharing information about suspicious patterns across borders. The Harwick case became a model for identifying and prosecuting international serial offenders. Universities worldwide revised their security policies and oversight procedures for visiting researchers. The Association of American Medical Colleges developed new guidelines for professional interactions between established physicians and students. Canadian Detective Inspector Sarah MacDonald successfully prosecuted Harwick for Claire Dubois' murder via video link in 2006. The conviction resulted in an additional life sentence, though it had no practical impact given his existing American sentence. British authorities similarly prosecuted Harwick for murders committed in London during the 1980s. The international prosecutions provided closure to victim families and demonstrated improved cooperation between law enforcement agencies. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit incorporated lessons from the Harwick case into training programs for identifying serial killers who exploit professional credentials. Agent Rebecca Chen developed educational materials used by law enforcement agencies worldwide. Dr. Patricia Hayes published extensive research about Harwick's psychological profile, contributing to scientific understanding of how intelligent psychopaths can operate undetected for decades. Her work influenced criminal psychology and law enforcement training programs. By 2010, investigators had confirmed Harwick's responsibility for 37 murders across 8 countries between 1978 and 1995. Additional cases remained under investigation, though advanced age and health problems limited Harwick's ability to provide detailed cooperation. The pharmaceutical laboratory where Sarah's skull was discovered was eventually demolished, but not before serving as a training site for forensic investigators learning to process complex crime scenes with historical significance. Harwick died in federal prison in 2018 at age 85, taking remaining secrets about potential victims to his grave. His death marked the end of one of the most extensive and geographically diverse serial killing sprees in modern criminal history. The Edmund Harwick case fundamentally changed how academic institutions, law enforcement agencies, and international authorities approach the problem of professional predators. The systematic reforms implemented after his conviction likely prevented similar crimes by making it much more difficult for future killers to exploit professional credentials. William Patterson lived to see these changes implemented before his death in 2019 at age 82. His advocacy work through the Sarah Patterson Foundation influenced legislation requiring background checks for medical professionals working with students and improved international cooperation in missing persons investigations. The legacy of Sarah Patterson and Harwick's other victims continues through the safety measures, investigative protocols, and educational programs developed in response to his crimes. Their deaths, while tragic, ultimately led to systematic changes that protect vulnerable young people pursuing careers in medical and scientific fields. Detective Santos, now retired, frequently speaks to law enforcement groups about the importance of thorough investigation and international cooperation. The Harwick case taught us that evil can hide behind professional credentials for decades, she explains. But it also showed that justice can prevail when investigators refuse to give up and when agencies work together across borders. The case remains a landmark in criminal justice history, demonstrating both the vulnerabilities that allow systematic killers to operate undetected and the power of determined investigation to ultimately bring them to justice. Sarah Patterson's skull, discovered in a laboratory basement 15 years after her murder, became the key that unlocked the truth about one of history's most prolific serial killers. Today, the Sarah Patterson Memorial Laboratory at the University of Minnesota trains forensic investigators and researchers in ethical scientific practices, ensuring that her name is associated with legitimate research rather than the twisted experiments of her killer. Her legacy lives on through the lives saved by the systematic changes implemented after Edmund Harwick's reign of terror was finally brought to an end.